Good morning. I'm the Reverend Amy Friedman. I serve as your Minister of Religious Exploration, and I have a story to share with you, which comes from a mother and an author whose name is Jennifer Duke Lee. She writes, I will never forget the time our daughter, Anna, hosted a sleepover for several of her friends, including Maddie. Maddie's mom informed me that her daughter would be bringing along her lovey, and she was worried that the other girls might tease her for sleeping with a ragged blanket, the same blanket that she had been sleeping with for 10 years. When this girl was around the people who knew her and who loved her best, she was never afraid to bring out the lovey. But as she grew older, she began to keep it hidden from everyone. Admitting that she slept with a lovey made her feel vulnerable and maybe a little bit ashamed. And as night came, Jennifer, the host mom, dimmed all the lights in the family room, and everyone got out their sleeping bags and blankets, and they were going to watch a movie together. But Maddie, she wanted her blanket. She was fighting a quiet battle inside her, and this battle was about the risk of vulnerability. Maddie was asking herself the most paralyzing question in the universe. What will people think of me? She made her choice. I watched her as she walked to the bedroom. She unzipped her bag. And she walked back into the room with her blanket tucked underneath her arm. And another kid said, "What's that?" Maddie had been found out. I was so proud of Maddie because here's what she did next. She sat cross-legged on the couch and she told her friends the truth. She told them how her mom's friend had made the blanket for her when she was just a baby, and how it traveled with her on hundreds of car rides, and she once lost it in the park, and how it fell apart a few years ago, and her grandma had to sew it back together, and there was this stitches that kind of looked like a scar. Everyone listened. No one laughed at her. No one judged. And then the most beautiful thing happened. One by one, the other girls went and got things out of their duffel bags. It was the night of the great unzipping. Out came ragged blankets, a bear who only had one eye, this thing that I guess is a rabbit, and a really well-loved cat. And then they all started to share their stories about their loveys, where they came from, funny stories, how sometimes they get lost. And everyone slept better that night because someone had the guts to go first. There's a C.S. Lewis quote that goes like this: "Friendship begins in that one moment when one person says to another, 'What? You too? I thought I was the only one.'" The first step toward friendship, deep friendship, is vulnerability. True friendship requires a terrific amount of emotional exposure. With it comes risk and possible rejection, but also comes with it the likelihood that someone else happens to know exactly what you are feeling. Deep friendship comes when you are deeply known. And the only way to be deeply known is to allow yourself to be deeply seen. That's our wisdom story this morning. And as you may know, our Soul Matters theme for the month is vulnerability, and we are exploring it in several of our classes, and I understand you will be exploring it in our services here. And I certainly hold that hope that we may share our loveys with each other, that we may be that bold. I can't carry them around all day with me though, can I? I want to invite all the children to come forward to go to their RE groups, and let us join together in song.
We have two readings this morning. The first is an excerpt from Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. If you're pretty sure that shame doesn't apply to you, keep reading. I'll clear that up in the next couple of pages. I start every talk, article, and chapter on shame with the shame 1, 2, 3s, or the first three things that you need to know about shame, so you'll keep listening. Number 1, we all have it. Shame is universal and one of the most primitive emotions that we experience. The only people who don't experience shame lack the capacity for empathy and human connection. So here's your choice. Fess up to experiencing shame, or admit that you're a sociopath. Quick note, this is the only time that shame seems like a good option. We're all afraid to talk about shame. The less we talk about shame, the more control it has over our lives. She continues, the definition of shame that emerged from my research is, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. People often want to believe that shame is reserved for people who have survived an unspeakable trauma, but this is not true. Shame is something we all experience. Our second reading is an excerpt from Self-Compassion. That's her book by Kristen Neff. Self-Compassion is the name of the book. Thoughts and feelings arise based on our history, our past experiences, and our associations, our hardwiring, our hormonal cycle, our physical comfort level, our cultural conditioning, our previous thoughts and feelings, and numerous other factors. We can't control which thoughts and emotions pass through the gates of awareness and which do not. If our particular thoughts and feelings aren't healthy, we can't make these mental experiences simply go away. However, we can change the way we relate to them. The gift of mindfulness, then, is that by accepting the present moment, you are better able to shape your future moments with wisdom and clarity. Not only do you reduce your own suffering, you are also able to make good choices about how to act next. It makes perfect sense if you think about it, but it's not a habit that many of us were taught as children. In the West, we are raised to be knowledgeable, to work hard, and to be productive members of society. But no one teaches us how to deal productively with our own emotions, especially the difficult ones. Here ends our readings. About 5 years ago, I was attending a yoga class on a Friday morning, and it was a lovely experience, as yoga so often is. And as we were wrapping up, after we had finished our practice together, the teacher was making a few announcements, and she shared with the class the following. She said, and just as a reminder, this Sunday we are having a class, restorative class that will be especially relaxing, and I encourage all you hardworking mothers to come and give yourself some rest and respite. And now, I'm very tuned into the fact that we tend to think of mothers as the only parents sometimes in families, even when there are fathers in the family, right? We sometimes say things like, oh, to dads, are you babysitting your kids? And no, you're not babysitting your kids, you're being a parent, right? And so my antenna perked up, and I said out loud in front of the whole class, hey, dads need rest and relaxation sometimes too. And the teacher responded to me, well, that's true, Seth, I know that. And I was sharing what I said because Sunday is Mother's Day. Now, I think we had two, maybe three kids at the time. I knew Sunday was Mother's Day in some part of my brain, right? But I missed it. And man, did I feel shame after that. I said in the moment, I said, oh, sorry, right? And I packed up my bag. But I spiraled out after that. I spent the next 24 hours thinking, oh, man. And my spouse also happened to be a teacher at that studio, a yoga teacher at that studio. So I knew the teacher, right? I was like, oh, man, what do I do? Should I go apologize to Corinne? Literally, it was most of what I thought about for the next 24 hours, about how badly I'd screwed that up. And man, I was stuck in shame, right? I was just feeling bad about myself. I wasn't able to, let it go and see that it was just a mistake and that's normal. I was stuck in that shame spot. As so often happens in our lives, right? As Brene said, we all experience shame unless we're a sociopath. And so it's particularly important to explore shame this month as we explore this month's theme of vulnerability, because shame is one of the biggest barriers to being able to be vulnerable. And man, vulnerability is scary because we feel like we are exposing ourselves to the world, to the possibility of being hurt. In fact, Brené Brown's definition of vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. I'll say that again. Vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. In other words, vulnerability is when we put ourselves out there, like the young lady in our wisdom story this morning did. It often feels really scary to do this, and yet we also value it immensely when other people take the risk. One of my favorite Brené Brown quotes is, vulnerability is the first thing I look for in you and the last thing I want you to see in me. We value vulnerability, and it's hard to do. And shame is one of the big things that gets in the way. Now, we Unitarian Universalists affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. This is a really powerful theological concept. And we often tend to think of inherent worth and dignity in terms of other people. Other people have inherent worth and dignity. But of course, it applies to us too. And if we do happen to consider that it means that we also have worth and dignity, we often tend to leave it as a statement that our heads understand without doing the work necessary to integrate our understanding of worthiness into our own being. As we heard in our first reading, Brené defines shame as follows. Shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Shame lives in that place of unworthiness within us, that place where we have failed to fully integrate and live into our head's belief of our own inherent worth and dignity. Because if you don't acknowledge the existence of your shame and work with it, if you don't do shame, shame will do you. Often in ways that bring really unpleasant experiences into your life and the lives of those around you. In the words of one of Brown's research participants, One time I stopped to get gas and my credit card was declined. The guy gave me a really hard time. As I pulled out of the station, my 3-year-old son started crying. I just started screaming, "Shut up, shut up, shut up." I was so ashamed about my card. I went nuts. And then I was ashamed that I yelled at my son. Too often, when we are feeling shame, that hurt and pain ends up getting externalized into the world, often causing harm to those around us. As Quaker theologian Parker Palmer writes, violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. In practice, this means that often when we're feeling shame, we might lash out or pull away or people please or do things that aren't in line with our beliefs and values as we're trying to avoid feeling the shame itself. Which brings us to our second reading this morning from Kristen Neff. She said, "In the West, we are raised to be knowledgeable, to work hard, to be productive members of society. But no one teaches us how to deal productively with our own emotions, especially the difficult ones." She also lifted up that while we can't change that we have them, we can change the ways we relate to our unhealthy thoughts and feelings. That's where we're going this morning. We can't change the fact that we feel shame. Unless we're psychopaths, we all feel shame sometimes. We can change the way we relate to our shame, though. We can how to learn more to deal more productively with it. We can learn how to cultivate shame resilience. Before we can cultivate shame resilience, though, we have to know what shame is, and we commonly confuse shame and guilt in our culture. Shame is when we make a person, including ourselves, could be ourselves, bad or wrong. Guilt is when we focus on the behavior. Shame says to us, "How could I have been so stupid?" Guilt says, "Wow, I really wish I hadn't made that mistake." One is about the person, ourselves as a person. The other is about our behavior. Guilt can be productive in a healthy way. Shame, while sometimes an effective tool in generating outcomes we want, causes harm. Raising your kids is a great example of that, right? Shame can be a really effective tool in managing behavior, but the harm it does to our children when we use it as a tool is so terrible. Now, shame can show up in our lives in many forms. Here's a few examples from Brown's book, Daring Greatly. These are from her research participants, actual examples. Shame is getting laid off and having to tell my pregnant wife. Shame is having someone ask me, "When are you due?" when I'm not pregnant. Shame is my boss calling me an idiot in front of a client. Shame is infertility. Shame is telling my fiancé that my dad lives in France when in fact he's in prison. So I share this with you in case you're less familiar with shame. I mean, many of us are probably intimately familiar, right? But we have to know what we're talking about to even begin to do this work. Because as the old saying goes, knowing you have a problem is half the battle. Beyond intellectually understanding the concept of shame and what's happening, we also need to be able to recognize the feeling of shame when it's happening inside us. We just heard some examples of experiences that bring up shame for people, but what does shame feel like in your body? It's different for everyone. For some people, it might feel like burning heat in a specific body part. Hot cheeks is a common example. But for others, it might feel like cold. Maybe for you, it's tingling or burning or itchiness, tightness in the chest. Whatever the signs are, it is super helpful in cultivating shame resilience for you to be able to identify for yourself the physical signs of shame when you're feeling it. What does shame feel like for you? Where and when and how does it show up in your body? Once we figured out how to identify shame, then we need to get clear about whose responsibility our shame is. We have a tendency in our culture to blame the outside world for our feelings of shame. You said something mean and it made me feel shame, so my shame is your fault and you need to fix it. The reality, though, is that most of the time, the shame was already there inside us. Let me explain with a story. I had two friends growing up, one of whom had an undiagnosed ADHD, right? And so that meant that they struggled in school because they had a learning disability. They didn't know this, though. And so this friend of mine, he struggled all the time with feeling like he wasn't smart. And he even got teased occasionally about it, and this really got ingrained in his system, his systems of belief. And so later, when he was in his early 20s and he got diagnosed with ADHD, it was like a light bulb went off, right? Oh, this makes so much sense, because actually he's really smart, and some of the intellectual tests that he took shows that, right? He's a smart person, he just has a learning disability. But even though he knows that now, if anybody happens to tease him about being dumb or stupid, he feels the shame, even though his head knows better, because that shame lives within inside him. Contrast that with my friend who grew up knowing she was smart without a learning disability, right? She was always smart, always did well in school, and if you tease her about being dumb or stupid, she's like, yeah, right? She doesn't just know here, she knows here. It just bounces off of her. And that's where shame lives, right? It lives inside us, and the things that people say, it just touches those shame spots within us. And so the shame is actually inside. This is actually a hugely powerful concept because it empowers us. Yes, people shouldn't say mean or hurtful things that might trigger our shame, absolutely. But even if they do say those inappropriate things and our shame is triggered, being responsible for our shame means we don't need to rely on an apology from someone else to help ourselves feel better. No matter how wrong the other person was in the actions they took that triggered the shame inside of us, our shame is our responsibility. You can see this in the fact that the triggering circumstances for shame aren't always negative. They could be neutral or even positive. An example of a neutral experience that happens for some folks, a shame trigger, is the very common question, what do you do? Our culture places so much value on work that if you are a stay-at-home parent, or if you are unemployed, or if you feel stuck in your job, that simple neutral question has the potential to hit a shame spot within. But the ultimate giveaway about shame being something that resides within us is that occasionally even a positive statement or compliment can trigger shame feeling within us. For example, if somebody compliments something we wrote or a piece of art that we created, that compliment might trigger the shame we already have within us about not being good enough. So recognizing that our shame lives within us and taking responsibility for it, it means we're not beholden to someone else to make our shame go away, but instead we can change the way we relate to it, as Kristen Neff suggested to us. Now, once we're empowered to heal our own shame, we can really set to work. Another powerful tool to help ourselves cultivate shame resilience is to learn how to shine a spotlight on shame. Because shame thrives in the dark and secrecy, and it abhors the light of day and being spoken out loud. Brown writes in Daring Greatly, shame derives its power from being unspeakable. That's why it loves perfectionists. It's so easy to keep us quiet. If we cultivate enough awareness about shame to name it and speak it, she continues, we've basically cut it off at the knees. Shame hates having words wrapped around it. If we speak shame, it begins to wither. Language and story bring light to shame and destroy it, she says. So shame prefers to operate in the shadows, in secrecy, without anyone paying attention. And it will do anything it can to try and throw you off course and stay in the shadows. And so, one of the easiest and most powerful things we can do to combat shame is to say, to name, to say, well, maybe to say it, but we'll hold on to that, is to name the shame, to put words to it. And I say easy because naming shame is direct and powerful, but of course it's also a really hard thing to do. because it's vulnerable. Naming shame is the definition of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Sometimes it can be helpful to simply name the shame out loud to yourself. Maybe it's helpful to write it down for yourself. Sometimes it can be helpful to name it out loud to someone else, and that's where the vulnerability can really kick in. If you do that, hopefully it's a trusted someone else who will respond appropriately to your act of vulnerability. However you do it, putting words to the shame shines the spotlight on it and reduces its power and hold over us. And we've talked about a few paths to shame resilience, and there are so many more. If you attended C.B. Beale's workshop on preemptive radical inclusion yesterday, you were part of the group that was invited to share the ways that you find shame resilience in your own life. And so here are some examples of other ways to cultivate shame resilience from you, members and friends of the congregation. This is your wisdom on cultivating shame resilience. One of you spoke about remembering what Kristen Neff calls our common humanity. Remember that also others feel shame, and that it's part of being human, right? We heard that in our wisdom story this morning. All of those little kids were feeling some shame about having a lovey. And when one person was vulnerable, literally brought forth the light to the shame, right? Then everybody else felt empowered to do the same too. One of you also suggested being kind to yourself, or offer yourself what Kristen Neff calls self-compassion, right? That's her book, great book. Highly recommend it. Another one of you suggested to remind yourself that it's okay to make mistakes if you're feeling shame, that it's part of being human. Another suggestion was to ask yourself, especially if you've been a parent to a child, if one of your children made this mistake, or if a child made this mistake, is this how you would respond to them? Or another suggestion was ask yourself how you would respond to someone else who was in this situation. There's lots of great suggestions from all of you, and I added another new tool to my shame resilience toolbox yesterday from the workshop myself. If you attended the workshop, you'll remember that one of CB's main points for us as we consider how to welcome and include people different from us was, don't believe everything you think. They were talking about the need to question your own assumptions and learnings as you're going through this process of learning about other people and difference. So similarly, I'm going to suggest to you now, don't believe everything you feel. Shame is a trickster, a lying liar. It's the voice inside you that tells you you are bad and wrong, when really our values and our theology call us to believe, to know in our bones that we are good, that we have worth and dignity without having to earn it, just the way we are. Our culture sometimes teaches us that all feelings are valid. Shame, though, shame is not. Shame is not valid. Don't believe everything you feel. And now, having said all of that, the most important thing I have to offer you this morning is that as you do the work of cultivating shame resilience within you, that it's essential that we do this work with love. It's so easy as we become more and more in tune with our shame to beat ourselves up for having the shame to begin with. Another one of shame's insidious tactics. Our internal response to that has to be a very firm no. Struggling with shame is a normal thing, and I'm not going to buy into this anymore. Because man, shame is just going to want to tell you, he's like, oh, see, you're feeling shame. Ha, you're bad and wrong for feeling shame. It just does that. And instead, we need to choose to bring love and compassion for ourselves into our being. Or using Neff's terminology, offering ourselves self-compassion. And shame will often try to fight back. For example, if you're trying to coach yourself against the shame voice within, that shame voice might try to tell you, oh, this is dumb and stupid and not working. Why are you doing this? If you hear those voices pushing back, it means you're doing something right. So keep going. Keep going with love, because ultimately, love, care, compassion for self, that is the antidote to shame. And our shame needs to be dealt with, brought to the surface, brought to the light of day, held and healed and transformed, Not only because it hurts us, but though that's super important because it totally hurts us, but also because it hurts those around us. Too often our shame comes out sideways in the form of anger, hurt, or lashing out that hurts those we love around us, right? That Parker Palmer quote, "Violence is what happens when we don't know what to do with our own suffering." Too often, shame gets in the way of us being present to our loved ones in a gentle and loving way. Too often, shame gets in the way of us learning how to be better, more inclusive, more welcoming people in the world. Too often, shame gets in the way of doing the social justice work that we believe so strongly in practicing in this world. We are called to engage with recognizing, naming, and healing our shame, and cultivating shame resilience for ourselves, for those we love, and for those we hope to help. My dear friends, you are going to experience shame. There's no way around it. What we do have a choice about, though, is how are we going to relate to it? It's not easy. It's tough, difficult, challenging work. And it matters in our lives and in the world that we affirm the inherent dignity and worth of every person, not just as the words in our heads and not just as something for other people, but as something we live and weave deeply into the fabric of our own lives. Learning to recognize shame when we're feeling it, taking responsibility for the shame that lives inside us, owning it so that we can shine a spotlight on it, remembering that others feel shame too and that we're not alone in the experience. All that and more is choosing to relate to our shame with love. All of that and more is cultivating shame resilience. All of that and more is offering yourself an opportunity to transform how you live in and experience the world. Let's do it together. Amen.
Is how